Albert Kahn, like many Europeans of his era, was fascinated by the Orient. So when he launched his Archives of the Planet, recording the cultures of Asia was one of his top priorities. Between 1914 and 1927, he sent photographers on 4 assignments in the Far East. In Cambodia, they filmed the splendor of Angkor Wat. In Japan, they filmed samurai processions and the passing of an emperor. In India, they glimpsed the private life of a Maharaja and observed a British viceroy hard at work. These images reveal the splendor and diversity of the cultures of the Far East, at a time of profound change in the relationship between the powers of Europe and the nations of Asia.
To have this material recorded is just amazing. They clearly thought that what they were seeing was special and treated it that way.
They are fascinating photographs because here for the first time we're seeing the colors of India in all their finery.
What strikes me as a historian when I see this is I realize how hugely important this archive is. It's not simply the quality of it, it's simply that they've got on film something that has gone forever. And here it is captured and preserved in aspic. And that's brilliant.
In 1914, Albert Kahn's mission to create a photographic archive of life on the planet was gathering pace. From his mansion on the outskirts of Paris, Kahn was sending photographers all around the globe to record the richness and variety of human culture. In May of that year, Léon Bussy, an officer in the French colonial army, approached the archive. He had heard about Kahn's ambitious plans and was keen to become involved.
Léon Bussy was a gifted amateur photographer, good enough to have won a prize from the French Photographic Society. So it was great to have a man like this volunteering to work for Albert Kahn.
Bussy was stationed in Vietnam, the most important country in France's Far Eastern Empire. The French had been in Vietnam since the 1850s, but it had taken many years of bitter fighting to take control of the country. By the end of the century, neighboring Laos and Cambodia had also become French protectorates. Together, the 3 countries were known as Indochina. It was a huge, sparsely populated territory, much of it covered in dense forests. Bussy took most of his pictures for the Kahn archive in the province of Tonkin, next to the Chinese border. Unlike most French colonials, Bussy was so fascinated with Vietnamese culture that he took the trouble to learn the local language.
The advantage of having someone working for you who knew the country so well was that he really understood the behaviour of the local people. And in the end, you can see how much he empathised with them, because he'd lived there for so long and knew them so well.
It's not like, a big white man came round with his camera to take pictures, but he clearly enjoys sharing some moments with them. And nobody looks sort of scared of the Frenchman.
In 1914, Vietnam was a mostly rural society of some 15 million people. Rice was the central element of the local diet throughout Vietnam. Its production meant unrelenting toil in the paddy fields.
In Vietnamese society, everybody, when they become 18 years old, the village give them a pieces of land to plant the rice, to get something for you to eat. Rice is everything to Vietnamese family.
In spite of being blessed with 2 annual rice harvests, In Tonkin, there was rarely enough to feed everyone. These photographs of a group of beggars were taken on the outskirts of Hanoi in 1915.
I think there's one that's really strong. I think it holds up today. The light is right. The body language is exceptional. The woman has all of her children kind of spread out on the street. I mean, it looks desperate. The people look like they're in pain. They all look like they're ready to die. It's very dramatic, and I think it's pulled off, extraordinarily well.
In Vietnam, however, things weren't always what they seemed.
In those photos, I would say some of them may have been professional beggars from some villages. They are seasonal beggars, not homeless. They have their house. So when they don't have to do the work in the paddy fields, they go out to big cities, begging, collecting money, and some visiting friends.
Though Vietnam was a poor country, it had a rich and vibrant culture. In Tonkin, wrestling was a popular sport. These men are praying to their village gods for success in upcoming bouts. The larger villages hosted touring theatre companies, and many had their own troupes of amateur actors. These brightly dressed girls look like actors in uniform, but in fact, they're human chess pieces.
Well, you wouldn't play human chess every day, but you would see it at the Tet Festival, the Spring Festival. A family would be very honored if their children, say young girls or young boys, are chosen to play on the human chessboard.
Culturally, Tonkin was heavily influenced by its northern neighbour China. In the past, the region had been administered by court-appointed mandarins. By the time Bussy took these pictures, the French had stripped them of much of their power. But they couldn't take away their pride or their glorious costumes.
In feudal Vietnam, normal man cannot wear any kind of robe or dress with dragon because it symbolizes power and the state authority. In this picture, this man, his coat has some dragons in green color, so he must be somebody of significant status.
Elders occupied the next rung down in the village pecking order, followed by the educated classes. This is a local scribe, the reader and writer of letters. He wears his nails long as a badge of honor. This man never goes near a paddy field. Here is a teacher. His tall chair signifies his elevated social position. And this autochrome shows a Buddhist priestess with an unusual symbol of her status.
The presence of the alarm clock is strange, but I think it's a symbol of wealth for the temple. Because 100 years ago, an alarm clock was very rare in rural Vietnam.
Vietnam was a deeply religious country. Imported beliefs such as Buddhism from India and Confucianism from China coexisted with local cults and the almost universal practice of ancestor worship. The dead were very much alive in the minds of Vietnamese peasants. They left food for deceased ancestors on altars inside their houses and outside their villages. On important anniversaries, they burned paper models to send presents to their relatives in the afterlife. Every July, on the day of the first full moon, ceremonies were carried out to release any poor souls who were trapped in the underworld. This priest is performing in front of a paper model of one of the 10 courts of hell. He uses his staff to symbolically smash open its gates and set the spirits free. During his time in the colony, Bussy recorded an astonishingly rich cross-section of Vietnamese life. From rich men to lepers. From the very old to the very young. Actors, factory girls, sailors, musicians, but very, very few French men and women. Occasionally in his pictures of Hanoi, there are French buildings and hoardings with Western advertising. Yet the colonists themselves appear only as tiny figures on the edge of frame, dwarfed by the landscape and lost in the background. But his pictures do show their impact on Vietnam. The French built cathedrals and opera houses and created roads and railways to open up Indochina to trade. This is the Dumer Bridge near Hanoi, constructed in 1902 by the world-famous Eiffel Company.
The Dumer Bridge is a huge lump of metal, very solid and quite handsome, really. It's about 2 kilometers long, the longest bridge in the world at that time. The French didn't pay a penny. It was the Vietnamese peasants who paid for it, and very heavy taxes on agricultural products. The Europeans didn't pay any taxes.
French traders grew wealthy by exploiting Vietnam's natural resources. While many peasants went hungry, colonial businessmen turned Vietnam into one of the world's biggest exporters of rice. There was also money to be made on the domestic market. The colony's budget depended on revenues from state monopolies on salt, alcohol, and opium.
In every town there'd be a building with a French flag outside it with RO marked on it, Régie d'opium.
The French encouraged the Vietnamese to smoke opium. They opened up a network of opium shops and smoking rooms. The Vietnamese were the subjects to exploit.
There were fortunes built on the sale of opium. Overall profits from opium accounted for approximately 20 to 23% of the colonial budget.
Opium was usually the preserve of men, but one of Bussy's most striking images is this study of a young woman surrounded by the paraphernalia of opium smoking. Like many Frenchmen in the colony, Bussy was fascinated by the women of Indochina.
I think his pictures of women are the best work he produced. Yeah, I could almost see some of these pictures ending up being in a fashion magazine today. The background is considered, the light's very soft and wonderful, and the poses often are very fresh and natural. I think a photographer today would be very proud to have taken those same pictures.
Bussy even persuaded one young woman to strip off in front of camera. For propriety's sake, he shot it tastefully out of focus.
The anthropological rationale for the film is probably an interest in costume and clothes, etc. And so, sure, there is an attempt to protect the sort of sanctity of this view by shooting out of focus, by respecting this woman. Yet at the same time, it's inevitable that there is a voyeuristic element that's overlaid within this film.
There were few women in the world of the Europeans, very, very few women. So the men, the Europeans, were always on the lookout for female company. They could only find it amongst local women.
Bussy's pictures portray Vietnam as a calm, orderly colony, but the political reality was different. As a soldier in the French army, he would have known that the French never managed to pacify Vietnam. Throughout their rule, there were small-scale insurrections. The French responded by brutally suppressing any opposition and trying to win over enough local people to overcome resistance to their presence. This photograph shows Hong Tong Fu, the French-appointed governor of Tonkin, denounced by many as a collaborator.
He worked directly with the French to conquer the north. To do something like regaining the independence, first you have to learn from them. And it's better to join them than, following some rebels in the mountainous areas without any idea how to save the nation. So he's a head figure in Vietnamese communist textbooks.
Elsewhere in Indochina, the French found it easier to maintain their power. In neighbouring Cambodia, they governed with a light touch and faced little opposition. In the 1920s, Cambodia was a deeply spiritual nation, where every local man had to spend at least a year in a monastery. Because so much of the land was regularly flooded, many houses were built on stilts.
This is eternal Cambodia. If you tell me that this image was took yesterday, I would believe you, because this is the traditional Cambodia as it always was.
This unusual photograph shows a Cambodian official working in the French colonial service.
These photographs give you a feeling of the transitional quality of things in Cambodia, in this period between modernity and tradition. You can see some modern elements, the hat, the moustache, the bow tie, but he's also dressed in Cambodian style with his sampot trousers. The interesting thing is the way it's all mixed up.
Cambodia had neither the raw materials nor the population of Vietnam, so it couldn't generate huge sums of money for France. But it did possess one of the glories of Indochina, the temple complex of Angkor. Built by the ancient kings of Cambodia, Angkor had been largely abandoned in the 15th century when Phnom Penh became the capital city. In 1860, it was visited by the French explorer Henri Moore. Europe was enthralled by his sensational account of amazing temples and dramatic ruins cloaked in dense forest. When Bussy first approached Kahn, he had promised to make Angkor a priority.
Angkor was a very prestigious site in that era. You were dealing with a set of ruins which could be compared to the Temple of Solomon. There was nothing comparable in the world. With all that history, all those memories preserved in its walls and temples, the archives of the planet just had to have it.
In February 1921, Bussy journeyed across the Mekong to get his first glimpse of the magnificent ruins of Angkor. His film and photographs depict an archetypal lost city, full of exotic statues and mysterious wall carvings. The tallest and best preserved building was called Angkor Wat, the temple of the city.
It has always been the symbol of Cambodia. This is the largest, the biggest, the most beautiful temple. You can hardly criticize when you see the general plan of Angkor Wat. If you are an architect, you can hardly find a failure. Everything is perfect.
Bussy took numerous pictures of Angkor Wat. But like many later photographers, he was also drawn to another temple built nearby, about 100 years later, the Bayon.
You had these enormous faces, 3 or 4 meters high it seems like, and there's maybe 70, and they're all looking in different directions. I think one of the challenges of photographing at Bayon is to try and get as many faces in the same frame. And I think in a couple of his photographs, he's been very clever to be able to find the right vantage point.
In addition to the small army of Cambodians employed by the French to clear the site, Bussy found the lost city of Angkor to be a surprisingly busy place. His trip coincided with an official visit by a Siamese prince and his entourage. He photographed local boys fishing with bamboo baskets in a temple moat, and a Cambodian family in front of their country's most important monument. It was built to represent Mount Meru, which in Hinduism is the home of the gods. But over the centuries, Angkor Wat had become an important site for Cambodian Buddhists.
I guess that it can be a little bit like Muslim people who go to Mecca. You wish that at least once in your life you have to see Angkor Wat.
At Angkor Wat, Bussy encountered a troupe of Cambodian dancers. He was entranced. In Cambodia, dance was far more than entertainment. According to one founding myth, the Cambodian people were descended from the holy union of a hermit and a celestial dancer.
Dancers, in a way, are the link between the human and the divine. And the dance had a ritual function. For example, the Moni Mekala dance is actually a rain dance. It's a battle between a storm demon and a sea nymph, a sea goddess. And when thunder and lightning go at each other, it brings rain to nourish the rice fields of Cambodia.
Bussy carried on to Phnom Penh, where he filmed the king's own personal troupe. This unique film shows the royal ballet in rehearsal.
To have this material recorded, to see the exercises, is just amazing, simply because no one would have seen them. No one except, literally, the dancers and the king.
In the 1970s, during the murderous rule of the Khmer Rouge, 90% of the dancers in Cambodia's royal ballet were either killed or exiled. The carnage almost destroyed a tradition which had lasted hundreds of years. Tay is one of the few dancers to have survived the turmoil of the Khmer Rouge era. Today she teaches in Phnom Penh, demonstrating to a new generation the skills Bussy photographed in the 1920s.
The training was very tough. The teacher was always hitting us, and they would pinch us and twist us in order to make us dance properly. You would spend the whole morning training to make your hands supple. They would get me to bend my fingers, and then to do this, and then to show this. The fingers curved like thorns on an orange tree.
All the members of the royal ballet lived within the palace compound in the quarters of the king's harem. The royal family itself was directly involved in training the dancers. Princess Bhupa Devi, sister to the present King of Cambodia, was one of the most famous dancers of the 1960s.
In those days, the dancers from the Royal Ballet were all one big family, and the king looked after that family. Everyone lived within the walls of the royal palace. Mothers with their children, and the skills and techniques were passed from mother to daughter, generation to generation.
By the time Buzy shot this film, the Cambodian Royal Ballet was already famous in Europe after their performance at a festival of colonial art in France.
They got to Marseille and were just absolutely the knockout hit of the festival. They were performing indoors, and there were such riots of people trying to get in that they moved the performances outdoors, and they played for 30,000 people a night. There was a real appreciation that there could be true and brilliant art in one of these native places.
The pictures of French Indochina are some of the most important images in the archives of the planet. But Kahn's interest in the Far East went further than France's colonial possessions. He made several trips to Japan, where he had extensive business contacts and close ties with the royal family. In 1898, he commissioned an elaborate Japanese garden in the grounds of his mansion on the outskirts of Paris. Undoubtedly, this would have impressed visiting Japanese dignitaries such as Prince and Princess Kita Shirakawa, seen here in 1923. 3 years later, Kahn decided to send out a mission to Japan to extend the small collection of Japanese film and photographs that he already had in his archive. Roger Dumas, an elegant former cavalryman, was selected as cameraman.
He was very gifted in so many ways. He admired everything that was beautiful. He was very sensitive and he had great talent. And in truth, when he took a photograph, it was marvelous because it was a real passion with him.
He arrived in Japan in the spring of 1926 and found a civilization which remained attached to its ancient traditions and rituals. He photographed beautiful shrines and fabulous castles. Dumas spent days filming elaborate ceremonies and parades, including the Toshogu Festival at Nikko, north of Tokyo. For the famous procession of 1,000 samurai, townspeople would dress up in period costumes and traditional samurai armor. But in the capital city itself, he found something very different. Tokyo was the hub of an emerging world power, a city that was in many ways as sophisticated as any in Europe. Japan had never been colonized. Over the last half-century, its rulers had worked hard to modernize in order to be able to compete with the West as an industrial and military force.
Tokyo in these years, I think one has to think of more as a modern capital city rather than as the capital of Japan. It has that kind of flavor to it. There is now full-scale industrialization. Many more people are moving into the cities. And indeed, the city has become modern in catering, both to the foreigners who come in, but more importantly, to the Japanese industrialists, economists, financiers, middle classes.
In Tokyo, they enthusiastically embraced the styles and technologies of the West. The railway station was modeled on the Central Station in Amsterdam, and the business district was nicknamed Little London. By the 1920s, many Japanese men were already dressing like Europeans, whilst young Japanese women sported bob haircuts fashionable in Europe and America.
There is a great deal of excitement about the modern girl, or in Japanese, the mogga. And there's a kind of media storm in Tokyo about the modern girl. There's a kind of object of sexual curiosity and of outrage among social conservatives.
In 1926, Japan was a country in transition, and the royal family were in the vanguard of the modernization process. International travel had exposed them to Western ideas well before such influences reached the rest of Japan. Kahn's friendship with the royal family opened many doors for Dumas. This photograph, taken at the Kitashirakawa home in Tokyo, shows European furniture in traditionally decorated rooms.
You can see modernity and the mix of modernity and tradition in the imperial family, in their clothes and in their houses. Sometimes it was things that they had picked up abroad. For example, Hirohito used to have an English breakfast with tea every day, and he really adored jam sandwiches.
Dumas' visit came at a turning point in Japanese history, the death of the emperor Yoshihito, the father of Hirohito. The funeral ceremonies took place on 2 bitterly cold winter days in the middle of a flu epidemic. Nevertheless, an estimated crowd of 2 million people came to bid goodbye to their emperor.
There is, of course, great mourning. One can see this in the film footage and the photographs. You see the officials, you see the crowds of people, you see faces reacting to this. You also see various groups like the priests, you see the military.
It's interesting, the behavior of the people. There's a certain coolness and curiosity mixed up with really deep feeling.
Dumas stayed on in Japan for a further 6 months to film and photograph the Japanese countryside. Then he moved on to the second leg of his mission, where he would also come into contact with Asian royalty. In 1923, the Maharaja of Kapurthala, Jagajit Singh, had visited Kahn in Paris. 4 years later, Kahn returned the compliment, sending Roger Dumas to meet the Maharaja on his home ground. At the time, India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, an enormous country of 280 million people. The map of India told the complex story of how it was governed. 60% was directly ruled by the British Crown. The other 40% was made up of 565 autonomous states, such as Kapurthala, theoretically ruled over by hereditary Nawabs and Maharajas like Jagajit Singh. But their independence was illusory. Britain's military power ensured that it retained overall control of India. The Maharajas were strong-armed and forging alliances with the British, signing away much of their authority.
They accept a very unequal deal whereby the British effectively allow them a certain amount of autonomy in control of their own estates and control of their own societies. But really, the British are so powerful by this stage that they don't have a choice. I mean, that's the deal.
Superficially, it looked as if everything was happy. I mean, they had a great deal of money to play with. They didn't have to worry about external threats. They had security of tenure. They had a great many privileges. They had their wonderful palaces. And yet they had no real power. They could rule internally, but never externally. And always over their shoulder was the local British agent who was quietly advising them, and they knew that if they stepped too far out of line, he would actually move in and actually depose them.
The Maharaja of Kapurthala was a well-known figure both in Europe and India. He was a naturally gifted diplomat.
Jagajit Singh of Kapurthala really was a most extraordinary man. Both within his state he's greatly loved, and I think externally he was much loved. He goes out of his way to cultivate the British. He goes out of the way to be an international figure. A genuinely friendly man, full of bonhomie, and I think in that way he made his mark.
Jagajit Singh was one of the longest reigning Maharajas. He ascended to the throne of Kapurthala after his father died, when he was just 5 years old. He grew up surrounded by governesses and tutors, whose job was to teach him how to rule. diet management was not on the syllabus.
The British surround him with governesses and guardians and tutors and the British resident, and they want to mould him into their character. And I think that must have been very stressful for him. And I think one way in which he showed that stress was by becoming a little fatty. And he goes on being fat, really until the time comes when he can actually assume the throne.
In his early 20s, his appetite for food was overtaken by a hunger for foreign travel. He circumnavigated the globe 3 times, visiting Japan, China, Java, Europe, Morocco, and the United States. Travel changed him. The pudgy young prince was transformed into a sophisticated man about town. Controversially, he swapped his turban for a trilby, cut his hair, and trimmed his beard.
This is no light thing because, of course, a beard is a symbol of your Sikhdom. He's a Sikh, and not only is he Sikh, but he's actually, he's the head of the Sikh family in his kingdom. And yet off he goes and shaves his beard, which deeply scandalized his people.
France, in particular, fascinated him. In the 1920s, it was the playground of the international elite.
There's no doubt at all that it was seen as the kind of the Thailand of its day. It was a place where you went to have sex holidays, and the Maharajas couldn't do this in England. There were too many eyes prying on them, but they could get away with it in France.
In 1908, the Maharaja acquired his 5th wife, Anita Delgado, an 18-year-old flamenco dancer from Madrid.
Anita Delgado's mother at the beginning was against this relationship, but as with many of the rulers of India who married European women, and this is not to impute the women's motives, the added attraction of almost unlimited wealth was in many cases more than their parents could resist.
The Maharaja took Anita back to Kapurthala, where she was known as the Spanish Maharani. Today it's a crowded, slightly ragged modern city. But in the 1920s, it was famous for its elegant buildings, visible proof of the other great passion in Jagatjit Singh's life, architecture.
You come to this part of Punjab, which is a little away from the main Grand Trunk Road, and here you find these extremely beautiful buildings. It is a very fine collection of European architecture.
For Kahn's photographer, Roger Dumas, Kapurthala was a feast of colour and movement. He carried both a cine camera and a stills camera, and made good use of both. Of all the buildings in Kapurthala, by far the most impressive was the new palace that was built for the Maharaja in 1906. It was a French-style chateau inspired by Versailles, Fontainebleau, and the Louvre.
He was the driving force behind it. It was entirely his concept, and he used to literally direct every single operation that went on there. He would oversee it very, very closely.
I think its speciality or uniqueness lies in its closeness to European architecture, rather than sticking to Indian, or rather than also having something eclectic, which is Indian as well as European features, because most palaces would reflect that. But this somehow is exclusive.
Inside it was painted with Belle Epoque splendour and decorated with extravagant souvenirs of the Maharaja's voyages.
I think the message that Jagatjit is trying to project here is that, I am the equal of Louis XIV. I am building Versailles, and I'm going to furnish it, with the best furniture that I can find, and I'm going to use a French architect, I'm not going to use a British architect. So I think there is a message here about his status and autonomy and equality with the British, which is being sent out loud and clear through his choice of architecture.
Dumas' visit coincided with another demonstration of the Maharaja's prestige, the celebration of his Golden Jubilee, marking 50 years on the throne.
It was a magnificent affair, because in his diary he records that the staff that accompanied the various Maharajas who attended the Jubilee was about 500-600. Their staffs. So a camp was erected, a tented camp was erected in the park of the palace to accommodate all these guests.
Dumas recorded the illustrious lineup of visitors. The great and good came from all over India, and for the Maharajas, standing on ceremony was de rigueur.
Conspicuous display was everything in the Indian state, and you can see that not only with his processions and his durbars, but also this particular ceremony of weighing himself in silver bars. And after the weighing ceremony has been completed, that amount of silver is then distributed to the poor in his state. The elephant was a war elephant, and they were very important symbols of royalty and status. One of the most curious elements of this film is to see this band marching towards you and to realize that the man in front is a dwarf. A dwarf was always to be found in the Sikh princely states particularly as a symbol of good luck.
There were numerous Maharajas present at the Jubilee celebrations, but by far the most important guest was the British Viceroy, Lord Irwin.
It was not every day that the Viceroy would make a visit to a rather small, rather insignificant state in the Punjab. So that in itself adds the seal of approval. So the Maharaja of Kapurthala must have been delighted. It was tantamount to having a visit from the King of England himself.
The festivities climaxed with a huge firework display in the grounds of the palace. According to the London Times, the whole event lived up to Kapurthala's reputation for perfect hospitality. The Viceroy wasn't there just to enjoy the party. Whilst in Kapurthala, he laid the foundation stone of a new public building dedicated to him, the Irwin Jubilee Memorial Hospital. It still stands today. Dumas also filmed the start of building work on another expression of the Maharaja's enlightened paternalism, the Moorish mosque.
Since my grandfather had, in his own way, always looked and searched for the unique, he was determined to try and create for Kapurthala a unique legacy. So during one of his visits to Morocco, he visited Marrakesh and he came across the Qutbiyya Mosque, which is one of the most beautiful mosques in Morocco. And he realized his quest was over. He'd found what he was looking for. Of this architectural style, I dare say you won't find a mosque like this in the whole of Southeast Asia. That's what makes it so unique. That here it was a Sikh ruler who decided to give his Muslim population, who incidentally was 60% at that time, a unique place of worship.
It's very striking in the Indian states how a ruler who might be Sikh or a Hindu would go out of his way not only to build, let's say, mosques for his Muslim community, but actually go and pray there. And this is a very positive aspect of the Indian states, at a time when in British India there were Hindu-Muslim riots going on.
Jagadjit Singh's passion was for architecture, but like most other Maharajas, he was partial to hunting. Dumas filmed him duck shooting in Kapurthala, a great royal pageant that was frequently stage-managed.
I suspect the real importance of hunting in this period, and you see it in these films, is that it was a way of cultivating the British on the side. It was a way of sucking up to them. And a lot of political business was done on the hunts. And the British expected to be invited, and they expected a big show to be put on for them.
While the Maharajas tried to impress the British with their lavish hospitality, the British flattered the princes by giving them honorary titles and a semblance of political power. The Maharaja of Kapurthala was a member of the Chamber of Princes, set up in 1921, supposedly to give the princes a national voice.
After the Great War, in which Indian troops had played a very significant role, many Indians, princes and others, thought that they were going to be given, let's say, at least dominion status, instead of which they found that they were given no more powers at all. And the only concession the British made was to form this talking shop called the Chamber of Princes, where the leading princes could come together and discuss politics and discuss legislation, a tiny concession made to the Indian people. But of course, all it did really, essentially, was to isolate the princes from the Indian people. It's rather sad when you look at that picture of all the most important princes of India come together. They have the opportunity to actually take some more power from the Viceroy to make life difficult for him. And they don't. All they do, they fritter away the opportunity. It's a kind of charade that they play of seeming to be important and arriving in their Rolls Royces and or bowing and saluting and fussing over who's going to sit next to whom. And you can see the opportunity just thrown away. And you can imagine that just outside the walls of where they're gathering, real India is actually moving onwards.
By the 1920s, Mahatma Gandhi was the leading light in India's anti-colonial movement. And there was no place for the Maharajas in his vision of a new, independent India.
In fact, in 1937, Gandhi wrote that the Maharajas were tantamount to little Hitlers in their own states.
British rule ended far more abruptly than anyone expected. In 1947, the British Raj ceased. Out of the ashes, India and Pakistan were born. In theory, the Maharajas could have hung on to their kingdoms, but eventually they signed away their traditional powers to join the subcontinent's two new democracies. When Jagatjit Singh decided to make his state part of India, almost all of Kapurthala's huge Muslim population moved west into Pakistan, and Hindu refugees moved in to take their place. To the Maharaja, the upheaval was a great shock.
There wasn't a sort of a clean handing over or change of guard or the change of the baton, no. This was a sudden, I wouldn't even call it a vivisection, this was just being rent asunder. My grandfather never quite reconciled himself to it, but he accepted it. He knew that this now was inevitable.
Jagatjit Singh died 2 years later, in 1949. Today, the extravagant world of the Maharajas is a distant memory. The rich colours of Dumas' autochromes have outlived the society that he photographed. Many of Kapurthala's famous buildings have disappeared, or are in a state of terminal decay. The old palace photographed by Dumas in 1927 is now reduced to a facade, where local people dry cowpats on its mosaic walls. The Jagatjit Palace, however, still stands proud, but it is home to a very different class of Indian. Since 1962, it has been a military school. The Maharaja's famous Durbar Hall is now a library where cadets sit in silence to read the lessons of history.
If I'm any judge of my grandfather's visionary capabilities, I think he would be very pleased that it is being used for the betterment of another generation.
The Kahn archives offer a glimpse of a world before globalization, a time when traveling to Japan or Indochina or India meant weeks on an ocean liner, not hours aboard a jumbo jet. They show the contours of a world before the mobile phone and the internet cafe, where traditional costumes prevailed and where lacquered black teeth could be the height of local fashion. As Kahn instinctively understood, though the modern world could create, it could also destroy. What was vital was to record the old world before it vanished.
That is why I consider Mr. Albert Kahn to be one of the great people of his time, because of his foresight. He foresaw that nothing is static. Change is constant. It's a law of nature.